Hey, welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
Hey, and I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro.
Oh my gosh. Synchronized Bible
Very
Bistros.
nice. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's good to be back here again. We just enjoyed a lovely meal.
Yes.
At the Lord's Chicken Shop.
At Chick-fil-A, yeah. Had some nice Chick-fil-A. But we should say, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with Chick-fil-A, but chicken fillet, whatever. But it is, we ate light for lunch because we are anticipating smoked pork for supper.
Yes, I have been smoking pork all day.
Sarver's famous smoked pork.
That's right. I don't know if it's
World famous.
World famous. Yes,
Yeah.
Everyone comes for it. So yeah, we're eating that tonight because we're doing a little. You're joining my small group.
This should be an interesting experience. I'll be with the Sarver's small group tonight.
And I was this. You were the Jedi Master in the text message, and I was the Padawan.
Padawan.
Yes. Anyway, and then someone says, "What does that even mean?"
Is that how they sound?
What does that even mean? Anyway, yeah,
I'm looking forward to it. Should be fun. And you guys are talking about Revelation.
We are talking about Revelation.
Now, we're talking about Revelation today, but not the same part.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. So we're glad to be back in the bistro.
So we just had Isaiah last week.
We had Isaiah
7.
And we shaved. Shaving Isaiah. Maybe I should title
Shaving Isaiah.
What if I made that the title of that episode? Shaving Isaiah.
I'm not very good at naming things, as you know.
That is true.
I wanted to name my oldest son Mayor Shalahashbaz, so that tells you something.
You're a different cat, Brian, but we love you. We love you.
Okay, thanks. And we should say before we get started, if you're enjoying our podcast,
we have. If you're enjoying the podcast and it's been helpful for you and fruitful for you, and you've been listening to us for a while, we would invite you to participate with us in the bistro. We've set up a Patreon, which if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a way that you can just throw a couple bucks our way every month, so we can continue the work of the podcast because we do have hosting and
there's some expenses.
Yeah, we're at Bistro East here in Indianapolis, and sometimes we're Bistro West in Bloomington, Illinois. So and if you do subscribe, you can get some Bistro swag.
Some swag. Coffee cup, T-shirt.
All the things. Everything that will make your life complete can be found on the Bible Bistro.
And you can show your support to the Bible Bistro. So the other thing is, I'll say, it helps us a lot when you share with other people. If you have an episode you particularly like or something that you find meaningful, share it out there. Also, go and like us, follow us on whatever podcast you use.
Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. You can find us on YouTube if you'd like to see us.
Hey, and I want to say before we get started today, okay, so that all's our commercial, commercial part.
We're done.
But just spend some time down. Some of you may have heard about the Eastern Kentucky flooding, and my wife's been down there. Her home county was one of the ones very badly affected, and so I went down and just for a couple of days because I have some working things I have to do, and I have to do some things this weekend. But just really devastating flood down there. Just the extent of the flooding down there was just remarkable. Shout out to my wife for doing some really good work there, and my son who went down and used his carpentry skills and his plumbing and electrical skills down there to help some of the people. And so just want to encourage you, even though the news cycle's moved on, I want to encourage you to remember the people in Eastern Kentucky and just the things that need to be done down there. So.
Josanne rolled up her sleeves and
she did.
Got to work.
Yeah,
so,
very good.
Incredible stuff going on down there.
Yep.
All right, so today we're back into Revelation. We've had several episodes in Revelation, and we've I don't know if we've gone kind of sequentially through Revelation or not. Well, I don't think we have. I think we've done whatever we wanted.
Kind of random.
Yeah, but that's what people like. So, anyways. Here we are. We're moving towards one of the things that we've talked about several times is numbers are kind of an important piece of Revelation.
Sure.
And it's also one of those things that can be kind of confusing for some people because we're very literal as we're reading today, and so we're gonna talk a little bit more about numbers today.
Well, this is very specifically aimed at a question that I heard recently. It was given to me, and so I thought it'd be worth answering. It's one of those things, and you hear some different answers to this. This is about the 144,000. A couple of different places in the book of Revelation, you have this group of 144,000 that are mentioned. We'll look at chapter 7 first first of all. That's the first place we really find this group mentioned. And then later in chapter 14, there's some really interesting kind of language. Again, apocalyptic language. You mentioned apocalyptic language. Numbers are often symbolic. They have a symbolic meaning. They're to be interpreted symbolically. We've seen a couple of examples of that earlier. And so 144,000, that's the way I understand it. Although I will say there are groups that understand this as a very literal reference to a literal 144,000. I'll try to give you a couple of examples of how other people interpret this as well. So
and why they're wrong.
I didn't say that, but look at, although they are, no, but look at Revelation 7. This is where we'll start with. You want to go ahead and read this for us? Go ahead and read down through verse 8 or so. This is the first mention of this 144,000 that we find.
Yeah. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. Then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. He called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. You keep going here?
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, you can go ahead and just kind of summarize. Basically, it says each of the tribes, Judah, there's 12,000, Reuben, 12,000, Gad, 12,000, Asher, 12,000, Naphtali, 12,000, Manasseh, 12,000, Simeon, 12,000, Levi, 12,000, which I'll go ahead and say now isn't always, we don't always see Levi in these lists. And then it goes on and it says...
Issachar.
Issachar, 12,000, Zebulun, 12,000, and then Joseph, 12,000, which often you see that Ephraim and Manasseh in the Old Testament. So we have Levi here, we have Joseph, which is unusual, and we're missing a tribe, missing the tribe of Dan, which is
yes.
interesting too. But we're not going to get too much into that, but it's something to think about. But and then from the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000. So now even that even number there, that 12,000 for each of the tribes, gives us some kind of an idea. But the tribes themselves being listed helps us understand, I think, how this could be understood metaphorically. And that is, in the Old Testament, the people of God were divided into 12 tribes, more or less coming from the 12 sons of Jacob, although who later changed his name's changed to Israel after he wrestles with God. But you can see that the listing of the 12 here, and we see this in different places. It's in different places in the Old Testament. In fact, if you really want to, I'm not going to talk too much about this. If you really want to understand it, Greg Beale does a great job explaining the different lists we see sometimes and probably why. But often Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, are listed instead of Joseph. Joseph is technically the son of Judah, but then Manasseh and Ephraim become kind of the stand-ins for the house of Joseph. Ephraim, of course, later on, and we even talked about this, if you listen to last week's episode, we were talking about the northern kingdom, which becomes known later after the division of the kingdom during the time of Rehoboam. Rehoboam and Jeroboam divide the kingdom. And so Jeroboam becomes king of the northern kingdom, which becomes known as Israel from that time, which gets a little confusing.
Yes, it does.
Judah is known, the southern kingdom is known as Judah, and the northern kingdom also sometimes is called Ephraim because it is the largest of the tribes that are associated there. And so Judah and Ephraim become one of the ways you can refer to these two nations. We see it particularly in the prophets. Sometimes this is used, and so probably because Ephraim becomes kind of associated with the enemies of, quote unquote, the people of God, the people of Judah. That's probably why we have them not named. Dan is also there, and there's some people who've made a big deal about about Dan in the book of Revelation, and there's some other passages that may lead us there. We'll maybe talk about this another day, although I don't give it too much credibility. But some see this as kind of the tribe that is going to give birth to the enemies of the people of God. Dan is a tribe that is far separated from Judah as well. And so that's why some people think these are not listed. Anyway, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that because I really think that these 12,000 in each tribe is giving us an indication. These are not literal numbers, right? These are metaphorical numbers.
Right.
Tribes in the Old Testament, the people of God in the Old Testament divided into 12 tribes. So the number 12 becomes symbolic for that. Earlier in the book of Revelation, we saw the 24 elders. And it talks about the 12 tribes and then the 12 apostles. So one of the ways to understand these two 12s And 144, by the way, for those who are math majors,
it's 12 times 12.
It's 12 times 12. And so the 144,000 here could be this idea of God's people, Old Covenant, New Covenant, if you want to say it that way, or God's people, before the time of Christ, and then the new people of God that Christ establishes through these apostles together. And then 1,000 is just a big number. So we're talking here about the entire people of God. And that's the way I understand this. Now, again, there are some groups who understand this literally, that there's literally this 144,000. They're going to have a special status or have a special relationship in some ways. Groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses make a big deal about the 144,000. There are other people who see this as kind of literally 144,000 from the descendants of Jacob. And then if you notice in verse 9, there's also this great multitude. After this, I looked. You're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later, I think. But looked has to do with this idea of a vision. I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. And so some people understand this great multitude to be kind of the representative of the Gentiles who become people of God, and the 144,000 become descendants of Israel who are the people of God. Again, my problem with that is that it's the even number in every, the 12,000. So I understand 144,000 to be a metaphorical way really to talk about the same thing that the great multitude says. This is all of God's people,
right,
in a large number, and this is who's being referred to here. And this is the first place we see this. And we're going to see it again later in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, that was one of the things as I was teaching, leading my small group through it. Is one of the things that's kind of a theme through this. If we want to talk about this now, is there's this idea is back here in verse 4. It says, "Then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, and we get the 12 tribes." And then verse 9. After this, I looked. So there's this idea of what he's heard. And then what it looks like.
Right.
There's this combination of that what he sees helps interpret what he's heard.
Exactly.
Through all that stuff. And so I think that's a really important theme because we see that, we're going to talk about that a little bit later here in 14 as well.
The same thing.
And even in verse 5 when it talks about, I heard the Lion of Judah, and I saw a lamb, one that looked like a lamb who was slain. So there's this real, Revelation has this real interesting thing about what John hears and then what he sees to help maybe interpret some of that.
And the way he describes these things are very interesting. Again, we've talked about the imagery, but I don't know what is the ear equivalent to imagery. Imagery is what you see, but there's also, and we're going to see this when we get to chapter 14, which is kind of really our focus today. There's a description of the sound, both the volume of the sound and also the nature of the sound is described. We have John using several metaphors in order to try to describe what this experience is like for him. And one of the questions you get when you're looking through Revelations, I've mentioned this when we've talked about it before, is how much of these are visionary experiences, which they seem to be. I mean, John will say, I looked and I heard this, or I saw this, and I didn't understand it, but then, the divine guide, this either angel sometimes, or sometimes it's the Lamb, explains to me or shows me the meaning of these things. And so is this a visionary experience, or is this John's way of describing what he's understanding about these things that he's hearing?
Yeah, I've always thought as the hearing this is if the angel or had said there's a lot of people here. You know what I mean? You're not painting a lot of imagery here, but by putting the 12 and the 1,000, you're getting the idea of the full people of God are here. Exactly. And then when he sees it, so it's like you said, how do you paint a picture with words? That auditory picture. And I think that's, instead of just saying everybody's here, it's saying no, this is the complete people of God. And again, this kind of illustrates what we've talked about, the difference in our approach to the book of Revelation, because we understand this to be apocalyptic literature. We understand that there's a highly symbolic use of things like colors and numbers and these kind of identities and even place we'll talk about a little bit later. We understand these to be kind of metaphors. We understand these to be images. People who are looking for specific meanings, like, for example, I mentioned Dan is not listed here, or Joseph is listed instead of Manasseh and Ephraim, rather than seeing
this as kind of a figurative or symbolic way of understanding this. There are people who are looking for very specific details sometimes. And the 12,000s, the listing of these 12,000 again is what some people will look to as they try to understand and interpret this. But again, my understanding is a great multitude, the 144,000, are essentially equivalent images, just focused on different ideas.
Yeah, and we've talked about Greg Beale.
Yeah.
He's written quite the volume on this.
Right.
And
a couple
of
volumes.
authors. Yeah. But, that's what a lot of the interpreters have said. Like, they see this as like, this is the same group of people, but one is an auditory experience and one is a visual experience of the group.
Again, as you mentioned, we see over and over again. So, well, let's look at chapter 14 then. Let's look at this other experience that he has with this 144,000. And go ahead, and I'll let you read down through about verse. Read down through verse 5, and then we'll go back through a little bit more slowly because there's a lot that's happened
here. Yeah. So Revelation 14, 1 through 5.
Yeah.
Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters, and like a loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless.
So there's some images here, some of them that are very common for us and things we've looked at before. Lamb, for example, we've talked about and is relatively easy to understand. We use this metaphor of Jesus as the Lamb of God a lot, and so we understand this pretty clearly. But then there's some other kind of very weird images that we have to maybe think about a little bit. And among those is this idea that these are those who not defile themselves with women and who remain virgins. This is probably the most difficult part of this to understand. Let me kind of paint a little bit of the literary context. We always talk about how important that is before we get into this kind of going line by line. This is the danger of when we skip around in Revelation because there's all these references back. Now, we looked at chapter 7 so we could see that this isn't the first reference to these 144,000. In fact, one connection you see here, I'll just mention up front, is in chapter 7. It says that they need to be sealed.
Marked out.
Right. And here we find that they're described as having the name of the Lamb and God on their foreheads, right? So it's kind of, they need to be sealed. They need to receive the seal on their foreheads. And here we find that they have been sealed, right? And so there's a little bit of progression here that we see with this. But this section of the book of Revelation, just to understand what's going on here, is we kind of have a large section. I'm trying to think. This is kind of like in those movies, especially at the beginning of a movie, you see where all the characters are being defined, right? Like everybody's kind of being brought out, and you're kind of seeing who they are. And a lot of times, things happen in a movie or in a TV show when a character's introduced. They always say, "Show it, don't tell it." Right? So it's not. It shouldn't be in dialogue. Well, hi, I'm the doctor. Blah blah blah. But they come in with a stethoscope and white coat or whatever, and you get a sense of their appearance. Kind of tells you something about who they are and this kind of thing. Well, you get this in this whole section. Really, you get a long section which talks about God's people and the enemies of God's people is the way that I would put this. So, for example, in chapter 12. Beginning there, you get the woman who has, again, 12 stars in her head, right, or a halo of 12 stars, talking about God's people. So you get this woman, and then you have the dragon introduced. And so there's this tension, there's this conflict that's taking place between the woman representing the people of God and the dragon who is the enemy of the people of God. And then beyond this, then you have this idea of a battle. The dragon is defeated in this battle. But then the significant thing is the dragon continues to rage, even though they've been beaten. And I'll go ahead and say just quickly, we'll talk about this another time, but that whole idea of the cosmic battle has to do with, and the woman who bears a child has to do, and this actually connects with what we talked about in Isaiah in last week's episode. This child that was born is none other than the promised Savior, the one that God had promised would come and who would establish his kingdom, his rule on earth, his eternal kingdom. And so you find this battle taking place, but the dragon has been defeated, right? The child was taken to safety, taken up to heaven, and the woman is protected. She's put into the wilderness and protected. And you find, even though the dragon is defeated, that he continues to rage.
Right.
And I'll go ahead and say that's a lot of what the book of Revelation is dealing with, is it's really answering this question. If Christ has won the victory over the evil one,
right,
why do things continue to be the way they are, right? Why does the Roman Empire continue to flourish in the original context? Why did difficult situations continue to arise for God's people? And the answer is in the fact that the dragon, though he is cast down to the earth, continues to rage. Okay, and that's really
amazing. Thrashing about.
It's central. It's a central point of the book of Revelation. After that, then we have these two beasts who are in cohort. In cahoots would be a good way to say it, with the dragon. There's the beast that comes up from the sea, the beast from the earth. I'm not going to explain this now, but I would say the beast from the sea is kind of in the first century, the Rome and its powers. The beasts from the earth are those local authorities that work in concert with the beast from the sea.
Enforce its.
In our context, it would be force those to follow the beast of the sea. And again, I'd love to talk about this again sometime. I'll tell you why I think this. I'm just telling you what I think right now, not why. But for us, I would understand that to be any system or any government or any power, any corporation, whatever that works against the things of God. We're being introduced to these characters, right? The woman being the people of God, being protected. We get the dragon. We get these two beasts that are the battle, and then we come to this passage after the introduction of these two beasts. Then we come to this passage where we have the good guys, the Lamb, and those who follow the Lamb. Okay, so these are, again, the people of God. This is the introduction, again, to these people. The way they're described is the names of the Lamb and of God are on their foreheads, which, there's a couple of different ways. This idea of naming things goes all the way back to the letters of the seven churches. There, it talks about a white stone that's given with their names written on it that is known only to them. The idea of naming here has to do with identity and ownership, I would say. So these are the ones that belong to God. I was thinking about this image, just a way to think about it today in Toy Story. You've got Andy. Yeah, Andy on the bottom of the cowboy's foot. What's his name? Woody. His name's Andy, and that's.
Yes, I belong to him.
I belong to him, and that's the way it is with these that have the name of God on their forehead. They are God's. They belong to Him. It also
and what's interesting. Just this is a kind of side note. For people that think like the mark of the beast is like a figure, it's right. The mark of the beast is right before this, and it says like they'll have the mark of the beast on them,
on their forehead.
On their forehead. Well, now we have the mark of God as well. So, oftentimes as some people want to look at the book of Revelation as like, what is the mark of the beast? Yeah. Well, let's ask the same question about what is the mark of God.
And that's the other thing I was going to say. It identifies them as well. These are the ones, and the thing about a forehead, if you, I'm not advocating this, but if you get a forehead tattoo, it's a pretty obvious place to have it. I mean, especially your forehead. I mean,
let me ask you this: you could land a plane on it. Let me ask you,
mine
do
too.
Do you think this has anything to do with like I remember flying on the plane and Jewish, they put the scrolls on their forehead.
Yeah, you mean the
Orthodox Jews. I just
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying,
because they would put the scrolls on their foreheads when they're praying, like in a little box.
Sure, and here's what I would say. I'm going to be want to be very careful on how I say this. I don't personally think this is a reference to that, but I think those are parallels.
Okay,
the same thing. And again, I don't. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this. In the law, I don't think that is literally bind these things on your forehead and on your arms. I don't think that the law is intending it to be literal there. It's basically saying keep these in front of you all the time. Your hands,
for work.
What you're doing, the words of the Lord should be, with you all the time. It should be obvious, like something bound to your forehead. So I would see them as parallel.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
It just popped in my head when we think about that imagery of something on the forehead.
Because it's obvious, right? You see these guys, and some of them have the big one. Even like Jesus talked about, some of your phylacteries are wide, and this kind of, you want everybody to see them, basically.
Yeah. So if everybody doesn't know what we're talking about, the Orthodox Jews have like an actual box, like a band they would put around their forehead,
and it has a piece of scripture in it. The Shema often, the Deuteronomy 6 often, or something else. It talks about binding those on, or writing those on the doorpost of your homes, and in Orthodox homes, and also like if you go to an Orthodox hotel, they will have in every room at the doorpost there will be a scroll with scripture written in it, and Orthodox Jews, you obviously touch it as they go in and out of the room. It's a good reminder, right? It's a good way to remember God's word always, and that you have this relationship as one of God's people. Not a bad thing. It just like Jesus criticizes, I think, in the time of the Pharisees, it should not become a rote, just kind of a habit kind of thing. But if it reminds us of our relationship as God's people. So what I'm talking about is two things here again. So we are owned by God, but also we are identified as His. So it should be obvious, on our foreheads. Again, we don't need a tattoo with the name of God and the Lamb on our foreheads, but it should be obvious always before people that this is who we are identified as. We are these people. And especially in the context of the first century in Rome, and we see other places in Revelation where it talks about this, where identifying as a follower of Christ could have consequences for you within community and within business and everything else, negative consequences. To identify yourself in this way is an important thing. And I think it's the same for us as well, not to hide or to be ashamed of, as Jesus says, anyone who's ashamed of me before men, then I will be ashamed of them, this kind of an idea. So I think, this is the idea of their identity, as well. Now, the next thing is, so it's what you talked about earlier. I saw, verse 1.
Yep. I looked before me and there was a lamb, and then I heard a sound.
I heard. And then there's this description of the sound. And we've seen this before in Revelation, rushing waters. And I always say before, combustion engines, before amplified sound, before, what else? Explosions, before TNT. Loudest kind of things we would have. Rushing wind, the sound of many waters, like a waterfall or a rushing river. If you think about the sounds of that, if you've been to a waterfall, the sound, can be super loud, right? And that's the description, the roar of rushing waters and a peal of thunder, some of the loudest things that you can imagine. So he's describing here not only what he sees, but he's describing what he hears. So it has a power to it, I would say. It has a loudness to it. But then he describes harping. Right.
It doesn't feel like a rock show to me. When I think of loud, I remember going to a concert once, and the electric guitar was so loud it was like a drill in your skull.
Yeah, I don't think it's like that, but the harp, if you think about it, would have I would say it's a melody to it. It would have so I think
wasn't just noise.
Exactly, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not just the loudness, but it's also the beauty of it, or the mellifluousness of it.
What are you?
I don't know. But anyway, so the sounds like harpists playing harps, and then here's the real key, I think, verse 3, and they sang a new song. Now that new song that's not the first time we see this in the book of Revelation, and it's not the first time we see it in the Bible. You're flip back to chapter 5 in Revelation, I think, first of all. And read that for us, kind of 5:9 in that context.
And they sang a new song saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation." So
if you go back and think about what's going on here, is John has seen this scroll that was written on both sides. So it's everything that God has revealed about himself and what we want to know. No one has found 7 seals. No one has found who can open the seals. But then the Lamb who was slain stands and takes the scroll, and he is worthy. And so they respond to him with a new song. I want to look one more passage, because about a half dozen times or so we find this phrase, new song, in the book of Psalms. I don't know if you knew that or not. We see it once in Isaiah as well. But back in Psalm 98 is one example. Like I said, about a half a dozen times we find this idea of a new song. And by the way, I should have asked this then. In chapter 5, it says he's singing a new song, and then what does it say? You have redeemed people from every tribe. That's fine. Every tribe, tongue, language,
nation.
Nation. So here's the idea. They're singing this song about what the Lamb has done. Okay. Now, back in 98, go ahead and read first couple of verses here.
Of Psalm 98?
Actually, go ahead and read verse 3.
Okay, verse 3 of Psalm 98.
1 through 3, I'm sorry. I meant the first 3 verses, sorry.
Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. The Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. He has remembered his love and his faithfulness to Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God.
So, and if you look at the other examples, and this would be a good exercise, look at the other examples where this is used in the Psalms. Look at the other example in Isaiah. What it's really talking about when we sing to God. What are we doing, if you would? You're the worship major. What do we do when we're worshiping God? You're
extolling his virtue. Exalting him for his works.
You're recognizing what he has done. You're recognizing his greatness. And so a new song is celebrating. Here's the way I'm gonna say it. It's celebrating a new thing that God has done. So if you notice in all these, like we're talking about this new song here, it's because God has now made his salvation known to the very ends of the earth, right? In chapter 5, it says, here's the Lamb who can now take the scroll, and he has redeemed with his blood, which is going to become an important thing here in just a minute again. In fact, that same phrase of being purchased, and we'll come back to that. It says redeemed there, I think, in what you read, but it's literally, it's the word purchase. It's not the word that's normally used for redeemed. And I think that's important, and I'll come to it in just a minute. But this idea of what the Lamb has done, it's a new thing that has happened. It's this new act in God's plan of redemption. And in response, and it often has to do with salvation. In Isaiah, it has to do with salvation. And in response, God's people sing a new song. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about this one to me is this is a song that's known only to them, and I would say it's an idea that they have experienced God's salvation, and so they are the ones who can understand. Right?
Yeah. If you're cut off from that, you can't sing that song because you don't know it.
Yeah, you don't know. You have not experienced what God has done in Christ, and therefore, how can you sing the song extolling who God is and the great thing he has done?
Right.
So that's how I would understand that in back in chapter 14 of the book of Revelation again. In chapter 14, this new song they sing, I always say position is important. And if you think about the cosmology, that's a fancy word for the way that the whole world is ordered of Revelation. The throne is at the very center of the universe. The throne on which God sits and the Lamb stands, right? Both of those are true. Is surrounded then by these 4 living creatures. It's surrounded by the 24 elders, and then it's surrounded in turn by these 144,000, the great multitude, all of creation, if you will. The throne is at the center. And so it says that they sing this new song before the throne. So the song's being sung to the Lamb and to the Father in response to this new work that he's done. So before the throne, before the 4 living creatures, before the elders, no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed. Now, again, that's not the normal word for redeemed. That's really, in fact, some of your translations will say purchased.
That's what the NIV says.
And it says that the same thing in chapter 5. It says purchased in chapter 5 as well. That same word is used in both of those contexts. In chapter 5, it's clear, and I think it's the same here. Remember that chapter 5 is where we saw the 144,000 to this new song, and then we see this idea of they're purchased. There, they're clearly purchased with the blood of the Lamb who's been slain. Mm-hmm. And so again, I think that's the implication here, although it doesn't say that specifically. The God's new work of salvation through the Lamb, through Jesus, is now worthy of response of the 144,000 who can sing this new song.
You can testify to it.
Exactly. That's a very good way to say it, that they're able to respond to this salvation work. Now, let's get to this difficult part. So they're described as purchased from the earth, and I keep wanting to talk about earth at sometimes. Earth, the way it's used in Revelation, is often negative. The earth is where the dragon is cast down to. Sometimes the enemies of God's people are called those of the earth. That's just the way they're described. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the idea of they are focused upon the things of earth rather than upon these heavenly visions that John is seeing. But there's a redemption of the world, of the cosmos. Then there's two words. Geis is the word for earth here, and cosmos is the word for the world. And there's a redemption of the world taking place. But another day we'll talk about that. But here it says they were redeemed, they were purchased from the earth, right? Mm-hmm. So they were taken back from the earth. Now, here's the difficult part of this. It says, "For they did not defile themselves with women, for they remained virgins." And this has caused lots of people lots of problems. I mean, it sounds negative, right, in terms of this, and I don't think it should be understood in that way. I think we have to be careful. I mean, mm-hmm. we don't want to be demeaning to any to a woman or anything like that, and I don't think that's the main purpose. Right. So I'm going to say, in the past, there have been those who've taken this. Again, if you take this literally, it's talking about the idea of chastity or not engaging in sexual activity. The interesting thing is, and this, again, is kind of weird for us to think about, shouldn't be, but nowhere else does God exclude the idea of sexual relationship within the context of marriage. Mm-hmm. It's seen as a good redemptive thing. In fact, and we were just, I always joke about this, but we were talking even earlier, and I said, well, the first command is be fruitful and multiply. Well, that was last night when we were talking, right? God says in the garden, be fruitful and multiply. In fact, he his command to Adam and Eve is fill the earth. I want mm-hmm. the earth full of people who reflect to me my image and my glory. I want them to continue this work of creation with me, in a sense, I would say, this subduing of the chaotic parts of the earth. They're going to join me in this. That's God's intention for his creation, as we've talked about before. But this idea then, nowhere else do we have this idea that sex is an evil. Again, within the marriage mm-hmm. context, mm-hmm. within the proper context of a husband and wife. So I don't think in this statement he is advocating some kind of I can't even remember the word I'm looking for, but celibacy is the mm-hmm. word I was looking for. Some kind of celibacy, the way, again, some people have suggested certain people who have a role within the church should be celibate, this kind of thing in various groups. And I'm not going to name any names, but you can probably figure out what I'm talking about there. But the way I would understand this, again, all these other things are kind of in a figurative sense. What we have, and this goes all the way back to the prophets. Hosea is a perfect example, right? Hosea talks about, and even the last time we talked about the book of Revelation, do you remember what we talked about the last time we talked about the book of Revelation?
The whore of Babylon.
Right, and we talked about this idea that all of the nations had
defiled
themselves by sleeping with this harlot, right? Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament, this idea of sexual sin for God's people as a whole, and again, remember, I understand the 144,000 to be God's people as a whole. Mm-hmm. Sexual sin is equivalent to idolatry. Mm-hmm. Basically, it's laying down with the false gods, or in this case, laying down with the powers of the earth that you're looking to for favors in order to help you. Now, dare I do this? Hosea uses this imagery very strongly. Basically, God says to Hosea, "Go take a prostitute for a wife." bear children out of her unfaithfulness, basically. And then after she is taken away into sexual slavery from you, you are to go and purchase her back out of sexual slavery. And this becomes a living illustration in Hosea of the way that God responds to his people. Even though they sell themselves into sex, right? Into these relationships with these false gods and these other nations. God's love for them is such that he brings them back and he takes his children as their children, right? Lo Ami and Lo Ruhamah become Ami and Ruhamah, my people and my mercy, right? And so we find him bringing them back. The book of Ezekiel, in
pretty
graphic terms, talks about when God's people choose to ally themselves with the Egyptians and their gods. He uses language that
will make some people blush.
I always love it when somebody says, "Oh, I've read through the whole Bible several times," and I'll always say, "Oh, do you might remember this passage?" And I'll quote it for them, which I'm not going to do today on the podcast, so you don't have to pause or anything. And they're like, "That's not in there." It's like, yeah, it is.
It's the 23rd chapter.
But anyway, yeah, Ezekiel 23 uses this imagery. Earlier in Ezekiel, we find this image of a child that's unwanted that God takes and raises and then marries. So that, God's people, God, the Father is seen as the husband of his people, right?
Yeah.
And this relationship that they have when they worship other gods, literally in terms of idolatry in the Old Testament, we see it. Literally, when they worship these other gods, they are unfaithful to the Creator God, and so that's the way it's described. It's described as sexual sin, right? So what I understand this to be is the opposite of what we see with the whore of Babylon. There the nations have defiled themselves, and talks about the abominations of their adulteries. This is the opposite. This is those who have kept themselves pure and undefiled from their relationships with Rome and the gods, the idols that they're called to worship in order to participate in the systems of its day. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
Now, just to make sure that we don't, just to make sure that we see that this still applies to us today. Anytime I talk about idolatry, I always feel like people go, this isn't one I need to worry about.
I don't have little statues of people in my house.
Right. I think idolatry. I'll quote a couple people I don't normally quote, but Calvin talks about the fact that our hearts are idol-making factories, right? In a sense, we continually make these idols. Tim Keller wrote a fantastic book about this idea of idolatry and basically money, sex, and power, in our culture have become for us idols. So an idol, and if you think of this, is not unimportant to God. If you think of the 10 Commandments, the first couple of them deal with this. That, first of all, you should have no other gods before me.
Right.
And the second one is that you should not make to me any graven image. You shouldn't make any carved icon or image to me. And so this idea, how do we make idols? I think it's when we put other things ahead of our allegiance to God. Okay? And I think it's something we need to think about in our culture, and that we often do. As I've said before, often even good things, if we make them the main thing ahead of God, they become for us idols. They become for us things that tear us apart from God. We are unfaithful, right? We are defiled when we use these things as substitutes for our allegiance to God. So I think our work, even our families, sometimes, if we place them ahead of God, can come that. I think we have to be careful in regard to our allegiance to our nation, whatever nation we are in. If it becomes primary before our allegiance to God, then it has become idolatry. I don't know. What do you want to list?
All the things. All the things.
Materialism.
Yeah, right.
Status. Comfort. can become for us this. If God's calling us to do something that's uncomfortable and we choose comfort instead, we've put that ahead as an idol.
We made that as the primary objective. I think that's, I think Paul talks about, like, we kind of have to always be examining our lives, working at our salvation, and I think that's the hard thing. It's easy for us to sit back, or I think that's their great challenge of where we are positionally in the world and what's happening for probably most of the people that are listening to us. To sit back and not examine our lives. And I think it can't be always navel gazing and just always looking at yourself, but it's examining the things that we've placed importance in our life, and then also, not to say that they aren't important, but what's the order of their importance in our lives?
You mentioned Paul. Paul calls greed idolatry two different places. This idea of a pursuit of money or love of money, right, becomes an idol for us in some ways. I'll say this. I've said before that we can tell where we place our allegiance sometimes in two ways: looking at our calendars and at our bank statements or checkbooks.
For those who know what a checkbook is, still.
I was gonna say, what's a check? But anyway, but yeah, where do our finances go? Where does our time go? You could add, I don't know how you'd check this, but where's your energy? Where are you placing your energy? And we make choices all the time, don't we? In terms of are we going to do the things that follow God? And this is the interesting thing. Then immediately what's followed up with this. So again, I don't see this as, women are somehow, well, I need to be careful here, but they're not unclean, and then
they're not. Yeah,
I think this is the equivalent to what we see with the harlot and those who have laid down in her bed of adultery. And this is saying these are those who remain pure from that. They have not committed adultery with the things of this world, but they have. Then the next statement says they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And I find that just an interesting statement. We talk about being Jesus followers or Christ followers sometimes. Follow wherever he goes. And, some of the places that the Lamb has gone, remember, this is the Lamb that was slain, is now standing, that they're willing to follow in that way. And the image here can be, because even the next statement says they were purchased from among mankind and offered as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. This idea of an offering or sacrifice of the first fruits could have the image of martyrdom along with it. But I think even if we don't go to that extent, the idea of that they are willing to sacrifice whatever's necessary, kind of like the image of living sacrifices, right? They're willing to give up whatever is necessary in order to follow the Lamb where he calls them to go. And sometimes that requires sacrifice. Sometimes that requires us giving up the things that we might hold to be dear or that might seem important to us. So here's the end then. Verse 5 says, no lie was found in their mouths. Lying is a big deal in Revelation. Liars are listed among things like sorcerers and all these things that we think, oh, that's bad. And then liars, and we're like,
Is that right? Is that right, John?
Same as disobedient to parents and that kind of thing. But I've said before, there's a way we can understand the entire history of the people of God as a battle between truth and lies. Jesus says to Pilate, when he says, "What is truth?" Before he says, "What is truth?" he says, "All those who are on the side of I've come for all those who are on the side of truth." There's a way which, Jesus says that one who was a liar from the beginning. So if you go back and think about the fall, it begins with a lie. The father of lies is what in 1 John, the serpent is called, the one who has from the very beginning, brought falsehood. God is truth. I mean, that's what the Bible teaches us. Jesus is the truth. And so there's a way in which we can understand this whole thing as truth and falsehood. And that's why it becomes for us, if we're going to be followers, if we're going to follow the Lamb wherever he goes, we have to be people who are absolutely committed to truth. Now, people are going to hear that in different ways. But I want to be very, very blunt and say that when we misrepresent things, or when we are unwilling to give the best representation of things that even when we're unwilling to say, I don't know, right? Then my question is, have we made ourselves untrustworthy when it comes to things like the gospel and truth about the kingdom? Falsehood is a huge deal. And here, these that are described as the 144,000 identified with God, purchased from the earth, these are the ones, purchased from mankind, these are the ones who no lie can be found in their mouth. Very important, very crucial image. And then finally it says they are blameless. This word blameless is actually used 8 times or so in the New Testament. Paul uses it several times. It's interesting the way we often find it used. I have a couple of examples here. Ephesians, I'll let you look up Ephesians 1:5. I forgot to tell you to look those up. I apologize. Normally I tell you everything we're going to do in these.
Yep. That's we just talked about truth.
Yeah, that was a lie. I need to apologize for that.
Galatians 1:5?
No, Ephesians.
Oh. Whew.
That's all right. I've got Philippians here. Let me read this. Okay, you got it. You got it. Ephesians 1:5. Yeah.
In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will.
Is that what it says?
That's what Ephesians 1:5 says.
Hold on. I apologize.
Uh-oh.
Oh, 4. Try 4. For he chose us in him, and you go back to our Ephesians if you want to understand what this means. Go back to our Ephesians passage, or our series. For he chose him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight, and in love he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ. Philippians says this. Let's see if I can find it here. I had it just a minute ago. Philippians 2:15, actually start 14. Do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may become blameless. There's that word, blameless and pure. Children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. So this idea of being, it's often this idea that we're called to this. We're called to live a blameless life. Finally, Jude 24, I thought this would be an interesting one. To him who is able, this is the conclusion, the concluding section of Jude, the book of Jude. To him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault. There's that idea of blameless. Yeah. Without fault and with great joy to the only God our Savior. So the idea is that God is the one who is able to present these 144,000, these people of God, as blameless in his sight. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of his purpose for us and his goal. What he's done in Christ allows us to be blameless. As followers of Jesus, we follow this one who is presented as blameless, and we're called to present ourselves as blameless as well. So the 8 times usually when it's referred to, and the Hebrews uses it once, Jude, 1 Peter uses it. 1 Peter's actually a reference to Jesus as the one before the creation of the world who's blameless, but it usually has this idea that we're being presented as blameless inside.
So I just want to clarify this. So it's not; these aren't blameless after they've been redeemed. It's they can still be a sinner, but it's
the new song. It's what the new work that God has done in Christ that allows them to have the status of standing in his presence without blame.
Blameless. Okay. Yeah. Because I think that's important for people to think, absolutely. Where it's this, our personal piety that we achieve this status, and it's not that, it's the new song.
Exactly. It's the new work that God has done in Christ is the way I would say it in this context, just to kind of explain that. So.
This is good. I always find Revelation, very interesting, and we talked about this last season. We talked a couple things, and I really dug into it, and I think. For me, it has become one of the most important books I think that we can be reading. That's
the interesting thing for me is that so many people will come to Revelation and they're like, I can't understand it. I'm afraid of it. Even sometimes you'll hear. Mm-hmm. I think just again having it, and that's why I like to talk about it, because I think having this approach, there's some important messages here, and it hits us exactly where we live. Right? Yes. It's really about living among the kingdoms of this world and the powers and the principalities of this world, kind of things Paul talks about, that we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but it fleshes that out, so to speak. It gives us a bigger image of what that looks like. When we understand it in the context of the first century, then we see how the application remains. Even though we are no longer under the Roman Empire, the same kind of pressures and the same kind of calls for us to be unfaithful to God. Again, using that term very intentionally, being unfaithful to God in our allegiance to other things and other powers and other whatever corporations, as I said, whatever. That call remains. As we've said about Revelation before, and as Bob Lowry, who's now gone on to his eternal reward, Bob talks about the book of Revelation as a discipleship manual. Here, it's how we live in the present world. It's not talking about a timeline of the future world. And so I think when we understand that context, like you said, it's super important.
Yeah, I was thinking about Revelation the other day, and we in the episode we did on Revelation on the Whore of Babylon, I mentioned that Amos, as I've been reading through the Bible, like some of the language is like it's this mirror, and I was thinking about this the other day, is like, how would you wrap up a book like the Bible? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, what's the last thing? Like, what do? You have all this imagery of the Old Testament. And like, for me, as I think about Revelation now, like where I previously had found it so daunting and so forth, but kind of going, this is the perfect conclusion.
Yeah, that's well said.
Like for me, I think about, I used to watch Lost. Loved Lost. And you got to the last episode, and it's like, and the real thing is, it's like, how do you wrap up this show?
Yeah, it's got so many threads,
so many threads,
themes, right?
And I watched it, and I loved it.
Yeah,
but I was one of the few that loved the conclusion. But there weren't, not everything was answered. But kind of going like, if we think of Scripture as a story, as God revealing himself, like, how do you wrap up this grand narrative? And for me now, as I read Revelation and the importance of it, like, it helps me understand so much more looking back on that, and like kind of going, this is the perfect conclusion to this.
It's very well said. I'd never thought of that before, right, in those terms, but you're right. I mean, we've talked before about how much Old Testament language there is, and so in a way it does kind of wrap these together and bring them together. We've talked before about the tree, like the tree of life in the garden, and the tree of life at the end, and there are some of those things that come back. But even as you're mentioning, these other things that the new song that has this refrain in the Old Testament, and now here's the new song, and the people of God are singing this new song because they recognize what God has done. And
I think about Hebrews. Like, Hebrews is that first anchor. The Gospels have that anchor point to the Old Testament, and then Hebrews is like this other, like, here's Jesus and the high priest, and you have Revelation kind of going, we're sweeping it all.
Right, we're bringing it together.
We're bringing it all together, and so
that's well said.
That's I just love that as we're going through this, and I hope this is helpful for others out there.
Yeah.
Because again, I think the book of Revelation, you've talked about, like, take it a section at a time.
Yeah.
But I think it is, for me, I'm just reflecting on myself, like one of the most important books I think that we, as Christians that are seeking to understand the life and times that we live in, that it is fruitful and a guide for us.
Yeah, I always say if you're in trouble when you start explaining the rest of the Bible by the book of Revelation, but it does in a way.
My gosh!
It's so we've talked about when you have the perspective of after the event and you look forward, it helps explain what has come before it. So excellent. Well said.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Brian.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
You.
We've had 2 episodes now about virgin talk. The next one won't be.
What else could we? No, I think we're done. We're done with that
for a while.
now, so
not until Christmas time. Anyway, so Brian, thanks so much.
Yeah.
And again, if you've enjoyed this episode and you're listening to us, please share.
Yeah.
We'd love for other people to join on the journey.
Join us in the conversation. Let us know what you want to hear about. What you want.
I know Facebook is kind of weird. Yeah. No one wants to be on Facebook
anymore.
We're
on Insta though, right?
Oh, Insta. Yeah, everybody's on
Whatever
Insta.
That is.
You can make a reel. And
maybe we need to make some reels.
We're gonna make a reel of Brian dancing. No, or me,
or karaoke.
Okay. Oh, yeah. That'd be something. Anyway, or send us an email. There's a button up there. I get a lot of spam on that email, but I don't get a lot of emails from people that, so we'd love to hear from you. And we do have a newsletter that we are going to put something out on. We've had several people sign up. And
good.
I've been negligent.
Yeah.
So, but we've just, if you go back and listen to Ephesians. We had 13 episodes on that, and we've had last week's. And so we're thankful that you're listening with us, and we hope that you will join us next Tuesday.
Yeah, good to see you. Good to be here with you today, Ryan.
Yeah, you too, Brian. Bye.
See ya. Bye.